Tonight, when you get under a blanket, your body will repeat something ancient. Because long before bedrooms, heaters, and insulated walls existed, survival began with the same basic idea. Trap a thin layer of warmth close enough to the body that the cold could not take it away. That feels ordinary now, because your bed, your roof, and your walls do most of the work. But during the Ice Age, warmth was not waiting inside a room. It had to be built before darkness came. And if ancient humans failed, the cold did not simply make them uncomfortable, it could erase an entire family before morning. On the open Ice Age steppe, the wind could pull heat from the body faster than the body could replace it. And for a species with thin skin, no fur, and tropical origins, winter should have been a biological disaster. But the first extreme measure was not what most people imagine. Because before mammoth bone houses, layered insulation, and controlled heating systems, humans discovered that the safest direction was not upward against the storm, but downward into the earth. They dug shelters into the ground. Several feet below the surface, the earth could stay more stable than the frozen air above it. And in a world where a few degrees could decide who survived the night, that small difference became technology. This was not primitive hiding. It was the beginning of human climate control. Because by placing part of the shelter underground, ancient humans reduced the wind, softened the cold, and created a protected space where hides, branches, grass, bones, and fire could finally work together. They did not simply endure the Ice Age, they learned where the cold was weakest and they moved their lives there. But once they escaped the full force of the wind, a new problem appeared. Because a shelter that blocks cold air can still become deadly if it cannot trap warmth, move moisture, and keep its own walls from freezing inside. That is where the second extreme measure begins. Once ancient humans escaped the full force of the wind, they faced a second problem that was less visible, but just as dangerous. A shelter can block cold air and still fail from the inside. Every breath releases moisture, every fire changes the air. And every warm body inside creates vapor that has to go somewhere. Because in sub-zero conditions, trapped moisture can freeze into the walls and turn protection into danger. So ancient humans built in layers, closest to the living space. They used animal hides, often with the fur facing inward, trapping pockets of warm air near the bodies inside. Outside that came dry grass, moss, and plant fibers, materials that helped pull moisture away before it collected where people slept, cooked, and worked. Then came the outer layer, made from bark, reeds, branches, or woven plant material, strong enough to break the wind, but breathable enough to let moisture escape before it froze. This was not random piling, it was thermal design. The materials were ancient, but the physics were familiar. Keep warmth close, move moisture out, and stop the wind before it reaches the body. That is why these shelters were more than places to hide. They were living systems built to protect heat, control air, and keep a group alive through more than one frozen night. But even layered shelters had limits, and some Ice Age groups went much further, building actual houses from the bones of the largest animals around them. That is where the third measure begins. And if you like seeing how ordinary human comfort began as extreme survival, subscribe to the channel, because the deeper we go into ancient life, the clearer it becomes that many things we treat as normal today were once solutions built on the edge of death. Then some Ice Age groups did something that sounds almost impossible until you understand the world they were living in. In a frozen landscape with few trees, building a strong shelter from wood was not always an option. But around them stood animals so massive that even after death, their bodies could become architecture. So ancient humans used mammoth bones. Skulls could become heavy foundation pieces. Long curved tusks could form arches and roof supports. And smaller bones could fill the gaps, creating circular structures strong enough to hold layers of hide against wind, snow, and freezing air. These were not simple windbreaks thrown together for one night. They were houses. And the most impressive part is that they were built from the same animals that provided meat, fat, tools, fuel, and clothing, which means one successful hunt could become an entire survival system. Imagine the calculation behind that decision, because a mammoth was not just food for a few days. It was a structure, a heat source, a material supply, and a future home standing inside the bones of a dead giant. This is where ancient humans stop looking like desperate survivors and start looking like architects of an impossible world. They were taking the largest creatures on the Ice Age plains and turning them into walls against the Ice Age itself. But even a mammoth bone house could not protect anyone by structure alone, because once the walls were standing and the hides were stretched over them, survival depended on what happened inside. Fire had to be controlled, fuel had to be managed, and the air had to move in exactly the right way. That is where the fourth extreme measure begins. Inside those shelters, fire was not just a flame in the middle of the room, it was the entire heating system. A fire placed badly could waste heat, fill the shelter with smoke, or create moisture that froze against the walls. But a fire controlled correctly could turn a bone and hide structure into a space where people could sleep, repair tools, prepare food, and keep children alive through the darkest part of winter. That meant ancient humans had to manage heat the way we manage systems today. The main hearth gave warmth to the center of the shelter, while smaller activity zones could form around it, with the warmest places reserved for the people most vulnerable to the cold. But fire needed fuel, and on the open ice-aged steppe, wood was not always available. So humans used what the landscape gave them. Dried animal dung could burn, bones could be processed and added to fires, and fat-rich materials could help extend heat when every piece of fuel mattered. They were not simply throwing anything into the flames. They were managing energy. And then came the most dangerous detail: air. Without ventilation, smoke could poison the shelter, and moisture from breathing, cooking, and melting snow could collect inside until it froze into the structure itself. So openings had to allow fresh air in and let warm, wet air escape without turning the shelter into a tunnel for the wind. That balance was incredibly difficult because too little airflow could kill them slowly, and too much airflow could steal the heat they had worked all day to protect. This is why fire became more than warmth. It became a controlled technology, tied to fuel, shelter design, airflow, and human survival. But the most extreme measure was not only what they did during winter, it was what they had to begin months before winter arrived. The final extreme measure was not a single object, a single shelter, or a single fire. It was planning. Ancient humans could not wait for the first deadly storm and then decide how to survive, because by the time winter fully arrived, the ground could be too hard to dig, the winds too dangerous to cross, and the animals too scarce to rely on luck. So survival had to begin months earlier. Food needed to be hunted, butchered, stored, and protected, sometimes using frozen ground, like a natural refrigerator, where meat could remain preserved when storms made movement impossible. Clothing had to be prepared before the cold became unbearable, with layers of hide and fur chosen not only for warmth, but for movement, dryness, and protection against wind. Shelters had to be maintained constantly, because a torn covering, a loose hide, a damaged bone support, or wet insulation could turn safety into a death trap before morning. This is the part that changes the whole story. Ice Age survival was not about one heroic moment. It was a calendar. Every warm night depended on decisions made earlier. Every winter meal came from work done before the snow. And every protected body inside those shelters was living inside a system built by memory, cooperation, and discipline. And if there is another ancient survival method you think deserves a full story, leave it in the comments. Because the deeper we look into the past, the more modern life starts to feel like a very old invention. The next time you get under a blanket, do not think of it as something ordinary. Think of it as the quiet descendant of every shelter dug into frozen ground, every wall layered with hide and moss, every mammoth bone raised against the wind, every fire managed through the night, and every plan made months before winter arrived. You did not invent warmth. You inherited it from people who had no modern tools, no second chance, and no guarantee that morning would come, yet still found a way to make the Ice Age survivable.